So that we can get into discussion, I want to bring on our other experts to join me on stage to continue our panel discussion. I'm very pleased to welcome Alexander Konen, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Time Matters. Alexander, please join us on stage. Thank you. Thank you. Good to have you. Yeah. Christoph Gemmer, who is the Vice President, Key Account Management for Europe, Automotive and New Mobility at Kuehne + Nagel. Christoph, great to have you with us. And great to have a Tier 1 perspective, Michelle Carter, who's Supply Chain Director for Europe and Asia at the International Automotive Component Group's IAC. Thank you so much for being with us, Michelle.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So join us, please. Have a seat. I'll take the end.
We'll take it.
Yeah, thanks very much. And as mentioned, we hope to keep this as interactive as possible. So by all means, again, questions as raised, I will bring my phone over so that I can keep an eye on the digital interaction. But let's kick off. We're talking about resiliency because as we've talked about for the last 50 minutes, the supply chain is under constant pressure. I asked Jean-François to try to identify, it was a bit unfair, can you predict the future, but to identify some of the risks that are upcoming. He clearly mentioned China as one, but I wanted to start with this panel's thoughts about where some of the risks they're already identifying. We can talk about mitigating them. I'm going to start with you, Alexander. What's the next risk, whether by mode, region, commodity?
The next one.
The next one, yeah.
I think I could talk about all the risks which are already let's say, visible right now, and the next one to predict is pretty hard to be very honest. But I mean, what we are seeing definitely is we see much more geopolitical risks at the moment in logistics. I mean, one is obvious, which is the Ukraine war. This is creating a huge struggle for us here in Europe. It is also, let's say, creating a struggle in that regards that many of the truck drivers which are transporting in logistics, they're Ukrainians and they're right now not available for transportation. It continues with the fact that the rail link between China and Europe is not working anymore. It continues with the fact that due to the pandemic and the situation in China, we see more harbor closures. We see, let's say, more ships waiting in front of the harbors and so on. And so all the supply chain, let's say, stress we have seen already in the last 2 years is right now, let's say, coming more or less to the next level. And that's very critical in our perspective. And what we also expect a little bit, looking also ahead into the future, that there will be more events like that. Now, I mean, we just heard it. We don't know which factory is closed next in China. And we also believe that, let's say, there are much more political risk as well, and that we will see more turbulences. So I think we all need to get much more agile and flexible in order to, let's say, secure resilience in supply chains.
Absolutely. Michelle, similar for you, anything that you're working with your team to try to anticipate as best as you can?
Yes, so I think carrying on from what you've said, that traditional kind of approaches don't work anymore. We have to be more connected internally. So traditionally, IAC is a regional organization. So we had Asia, UK, Europe, and North America. And what we've realized within our supply chain team is, although our business operates regionally, we must be connected. So we have things like communities of practice, where our supply chain teams work together. We have digital sharing platforms where we can share all of our resources, share all of our knowledge, and talk about how we can resolve those issues. And also, it's really important to be connected with our logistics service providers. So when we talk about what's a new normal, what's resilience, and white glove services, typically now, because of the need to be more flexible and proactive, the white glove service is actually becoming the norm. That is what our expectations are from our logistics service providers, and that will continue.
Absolutely. Christoph?
Yeah, well, I fully agree with you that the connection between the service provider and the OEMs and the tier and suppliers is very important. And as more as we are connected, the better the visibility is going forward, right?
Mm-hmm.
Michelle, I think I wanted to pick up on what you mentioned there, perhaps about working more as a global team as opposed to perhaps in silos. As I talked about with Jean-François, clearly there's perhaps a task force mode that we've seen across the supply chain, a sort of constant daily set of meetings and interaction. Again, how is that how do you see that really changing the way you partner, or let's say organize your supply chain and perhaps partner more widely?
Yes, so as I said, we were traditionally kind of regional, and I guess we are from a business operating perspective. But when we look at supply chain and particularly logistics, we need to look at the whole network. So there isn't the opportunity to kind of do the traditional focus on tariff reduction. We have to look at the whole network, how that network is designed, what are the engineering opportunities that we have to kind of reduce the footprint, the miles traveled, and be more consolidated. And we really need logistics partners that provide that kind of service. We don't have the core capability in transport management systems, network optimization tools, dynamic balancing, enhanced reporting about how our network is operating. And although, we have providers in Europe and providers in North America or China, we actually all need to get together and understand the entire network.
Alexander, I think it was interesting what Michelle said about the normalization of the white glove treatment, so to speak. Obviously, your company works closely to deal with, often, to deal with emergencies, to perhaps last resorts. But are you seeing quite a shift in how you work with those companies, perhaps not just at the last minute, but in a bit more of a consistent way?
Not yet, to be very honest. No? I mean, what we see at the moment rather is, let's say, first of all, I mean, if you're looking on my business segment, time critical, I mean, most of the time, let's say, customers of ours usually say, we don't want to use time critical services because they are usually very expensive, and usually, basically, then you are already in a situation where your production is heavily stressed. And what we see right now, there is much more interest in the services we are providing at the moment. Sure, I mean, that's quite obvious because supply chains are really stressed. And what we see more and more is indeed discussions with our customers, how we, let's say, can pre-plan for emergencies. Because I think that's what can make a difference right now. You cannot anticipate on everything, but there's a lot of things you can prepare. No? For instance, you can set up frame contracts before you really need them. Yeah? You can sit down, basically, and with a company like ISC, for instance, and pre-discuss, let's say, where are your production facilities, what kind of challenges do you might have in your production, and then you can prepare those cases. And I think that can help us to be more resilient, and it is also a possibility to save costs, really, in the case of an emergency. But I think one of the lacks we are having in the industry at the moment as a logistic provider is really, first of all, to have really data transparency from our customers. Usually we tend to get this data transparency once a year, when the tender is out, yeah, and with those tenders, then you see, let's say, volumes and movements and so on. But I think it makes sense probably to integrate much more in production planning as well, to understand a little bit basically also where, let's say, factories are located, where production plants are being built up, and help, let's say, in an integral way as an LSP, our customers, be it OEMs or tier one suppliers, to build, let's say, a more resilient supply chain.
Christoph, for Kuehne+Nagel, you do have a time-critical unit as well as clearly working as freight forwarding and connecting across. So how is that? How are you seeing perhaps more efforts to work in advance, anticipating, perhaps even getting to predictive areas?
What we have seen over the course of the last 2 years is that the collaboration between our customer base and us has extended, and the collaboration is very important for us to have a kind of pre-planning, to be able to adapt the customer needs into allocations, into space, into equipment. And that is very important, that we know it up front. We have kind of planning visibility for us so that we can make sure we have the right space and allocation ready for our customers.
Michelle, how do you see that? Does that sound the right direction for IAC to be sharing more? I mean, we'll come on to in a moment, I'm sure, around the challenges in sharing certain aspects of information in real time. But in general, for this aspect of pre-planning and preparation is...
Absolutely, and there are opportunities to be able to plan. Not everything is massively urgent or needed right away, and it's kind of understanding what things are and what things not. So, for example, if you really understand your customer, you get to know your customer, you get to know their demand, then 75% of it is more normalized, or you understand how you can make it more normalized. You have the opportunity to iron out some of the volatility, and then that really leaves your team better able to cope with the exceptions. And it's those exceptions that we need to manage. And then it's about understanding your network, understanding what mode is most appropriate for the different lanes, and sharing that information with your partners. If we don't share information about our routes, our loadings, our required frequency, even if there are exceptions, then we can't manage the norm, and we really need to focus on making that more predictable. So trying to make some of the unpredictable predictable, and then we can manage the exceptions better, but very, very close working with our partners.
And it's been commented already on the digital chat, I think a few times. We mentioned it earlier with Jean-Francois. Clearly, those exceptions, they are probably more frequent than we've ever seen them. Are you able, as IAC, to share these updates, forecasts with more frequency, more regularity with your providers? Or is that still very difficult because of where you need it upstream, so to speak? So how are you, the balance between what you're getting from OEMs to what you can share?
Recently, more recently, and even more so in the current environment, we can't have multiple providers. We have to have real strategic partners, and they're the people that when we start with them, we make sure that they fully understand our network. They understand all of our lanes. We understand what the customer delivery frequencies are in the norm. But then we also plan, so as soon as we know what's happening with our customer, as soon as we've got revised schedules, we're actually sharing that with them as well. So we're much, much more responsive about how do we react to changing load requirements, because additionally, we don't want to incur the cost of cancelled transportations or lorries that turn up and then we suddenly realise we haven't got a load for them. So we have to be very quick in sharing the information as soon as we know it, and even better, working with those providers, because they know their networks really well, they know the providers really well, and they understand what's going on in the actual network itself. So, for example, with the Ukraine, we're constantly monitoring border delays, we're constantly monitoring how those trucks are moving, what the situation is with drivers. So rather than us having to go and speak to kind of 40, 50 carriers, we're using a service provider that's actually a single point of contact, but they're managing the network for us because that's their expertise.
Christoph, does that sort of reflect how you're working with your manufacturers, or would you sort of see other areas, gaps perhaps, that could be filled more effectively in terms of this transparency?
Well, what I certainly see is that you're absolutely right. Somebody to manage your complete supply chain and manage and providing you the visibility of your parts, and probably even down to the part level would be ideal, so that you always know where your parts are at the middle of the night, for example. And what we are doing, we are also working with predictive ETAs, especially in the current disrupted sea freight market. We are really trying to predict with big data better when the vessels are arriving. So to give better visibility and to probably a more accurate visibility than is currently out in the market.
It's very true. I mean, when I talk about a logistics service provider, we talk about end-to-end supply chains. Actually, what we need is end-to-end logistics. So I want one provider that has the knowledge to deal with multiple modes. I want a provider that actually manages all the carriers, so I don't have to deal with lots of them. And that includes also their performance, their utilization, actually managing kind of the carrier payment side for us as well, because We don't want to be doing that. And also providing the white glove service and any out of hours service. So if I've got a particular risk or I need parts that look in doubt of arriving at 12 o'clock in the night, my supply chain teams can just pick up the phone and know that somebody's going to actually do the chasing around and sort that out for them.
I think looking on the request you have that you would like to work with, let's say, less suppliers and which are taking more control for you, I think it's important as well to understand a little bit then that usually those suppliers not necessarily have, let's say, the expertise across the globe in all the different modes of transport and so on. So they will have to rely on subcontractors as well. And in that regard, I think it's important that we, let's say, as logistics service providers are also working closer together, that we make sure that, let's say, data runs flawless, let's say, from you to your 4PL to the 3PL and then to the 2PL. And that we make sure that, let's say, across the, let's say, logistics chain as well, there's more transparency. Because in the traditional way of working, what we see today very often is that logistic providers are, let's say, limiting the amount of data they are sharing with each other. They do it partly for compliance reasons, but also partly, let's say, because they simply don't have the technical interfaces. And I think if you would like to really achieve resilience, then you must make sure that you have a really, let's say, flawless flow of data information through the supply chain as well.
So what we do in North America, which we're actually bringing into Europe, is we actually have a logistics service provider who's the key focus point, but then we have other service providers for specialist premium freight, parcel freight, but they all provide the information into that key logistics service provider so that within their TMS we have an entire view of all of our transportation. And that is what you're saying, you know, you need to work in partnership as well.
And I think that a single service provider who gives you the visibility and needs also to verify the information they are getting from their peers or from the other logistics provider you have contracted. And that is very important to verify and to double check the information if that's right. And that's why I said it's very important to have good data, to combine this data and make analytics of the data and check if those are really the right data.
Yeah. Indeed.
Christoph, if we can talk about the ETA predictiveness that you mentioned. How effective is it working right now? It's such, I mean, in theory, historical data should give us a good sense, but we're in ahistorical times perhaps at the moment. So is it predicting those ETAs as our limits to what it can do right now?
There are certainly limits to the quality at the moment, and the lifetime of this prediction is very short at the moment because with all those disruptions, you never know who's closing down. And what we currently see is that, as we already said, in Shanghai, the vessels are queuing up, and that will have a roller coaster effect to the rest of the world going forward. What we are trying is combining data of the vessels, AES data, harbor information on what the queues are in front of the harbors in order to predict better when the vessel finally will berth. And that is very important in order to have a better and more concrete information to our customer base so that they know when they can expect their cargo finally.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think over the last 2 weeks, probably most of us have seen the charts out of China, the inability to see the sea for the ships that are seemingly blocking there. So I'm sure it's got your work cut out for you there. But clearly it's important, although interesting, Michelle, your note, it's still going to be important to know who to call in the middle of the night, it sounds like.
Absolutely. It does happen, and, you know, it is changing. Things happen kind of without a whole load of notice. So it's highly important then that the supply chain managers that are based in all of our plant have that point of contact and that trust that they can pick up the phone, and they don't have to have multiple lists of different carrier contact numbers. They've got somebody who can actually orchestrate that for them.
Mm. Yeah, but ideally you have the visibility that you don't need to call in the middle of the night, but that you have the visibility and you can check, okay, during the daytime are my parts arriving? Yeah. And then of course you don't even need to do that. Yeah, but certainly I know these kind of things happen, and it happens quite frequently, and that's why people like Alexander and his team, and we, with our quick team, are there to help you.
Yeah, indeed, and you know, without wanting to swear on stage, it happens. You know, you have to be able to respond to that, and it's not a perfect world. It's, as I said, we can work with providers to make some of the unpredictable more predictable, but ultimately our customers are also working in a very dynamic market where, you know, they're trying to balance their production and obviously optimize what cars they're producing. So the fact that we can do that and have that person available is really important to us, and it is a very important part of the service that we ask for.
I think that there's one topic we have to see as well, no? And I mean, looking, let's say, on traditional way of working together in our industry, I mean, obviously, let's say we like to plan everything, yeah? We like to plan really ahead properly and, let's say, set up ETAs, whatever, fixed pickup times and so on, no? And I mean, obviously, if you see disruption in your supply chain, that doesn't work any longer. And I think what we have to do as well, we have to accept a little bit that we give each other in the supply chain more leg room, yeah? That we have possibility to really maneuver a little bit around, that we are able to, let's say, in a flexible way, take decisions as your LSPs to change, let's say, from one transport mode to another one. Because, I mean, we yesterday just discussed it, let's say, over a glass of beer. Let's say, creativity is really required nowadays in order to fix all those loopholes which we are having in global logistics. And what helps us in our company quite a lot there in that regards, and I can only invite, let's say, any tier 1 or OEM to do the same, is when customers are sharing with us what they really need, what really their hard deadline is, not what the contract says, but really what is required. Then we can also, let's say, find the right solution and, let's say, plan it also in an economical, sensible way. Because, I mean, just looking on a car, now, what does it help if you speed up the part from China if the one from Mexico is delayed? You still can't build your car. Yeah, probably you have wasted a lot of money on the transportation from China, and still the car is, let's say, sitting idle there. And I think if let's say, we share more transparency and accept also that we are stepping outside our contract and try to flexible solutions, then I think we at least can get the supply chain up and running again, yeah, and help you at least to deliver to your end customer again.
And that's what we have seen also over the course of the last 2 years, the flexibility to switch from sea freight to rail to air or sea air.
Or long distance.
Yeah. And so this flexibility, and it's a lot of workload all the logistics providers have been done in the last couple of months, especially with all those changes, with all those disruptions that really caused some headaches, I can tell.
And I don't, it's not going to change because predominantly what we need to see is you know, when we go to a logistics provider, because you're dealing with that day in, day out, be it road, be it sea, be it air, whatever mode of transport it is, if something happens, then you're ideally in the position to switch it. So if I have a company that stops shipping in Dover, you can very quickly switch it to somewhere else. Or if I have a logistics provider that we need extra loads on very quickly, then you have the knowledge of the market, of the people that you're dealing with, and can respond far more quickly than I have, 26 different supply chain teams phoning different regional carriers. It's much easier because you have that capability, and that's really why we do it, why we look to partner with people that can have the knowledge to respond more quickly than we can ourselves.
It's really important to sort of make the distinction too. I mean, resiliency is also not to be overexposed to one single source and to be over-reliant. I mean, I take it the interface that you're more talking about, it's not a single reliance on one provider to do everything, clearly. It's an interface to help support. Expression in the US and the UK is often one neck to choke. Hopefully it's perhaps not necessarily in that context either. But do you see that? Do you see it more that way? This is an important interface, or does it also give more opportunity to hand over more responsibility in areas of the supply chain? To you, Michelle. Sorry.
Yes, I think It's not that we don't want to handle or have more responsibility in supply chain. It's recognizing where we are good, what we're good at, what we need to focus on, and where we can enhance the service that we're giving to people that are kind of more experts in that field. So we wouldn't typically have one logistics provider. It's about having the right provider for the right mode, the right that can give you the information. But it is absolutely, as we spoke about earlier, knowing those loads, knowing those lanes, knowing what we need on a regular basis, and actually sharing information and consolidating information so that we can do the analytics and kind of understand what's normal and what's predictable.
And knowing that routes, you can have backup plans in place in order to switch from one to the other once there is a disruption in the one lane.
Yeah. With Jean-François, we spoke about planning supply chains up front with more of these considerations in view, having access to a particular transport mode, reducing distances, for example, localization, as the expression was used there. Also, different inventory approaches where is needed. Maybe I'll start with you, Christoph, in terms of what you're seeing with your customers. Are you working in a way to sort of more strategically plan things like that? Having more inventory in a particular location in advance, for example?
I mean, going forward, I see that our customer base is building up inventories due to the disruption and due to the uncertainties we see in the market. But I'm not sure how long that will last. I mean, that's a huge cost factor to carry that inventory with you. And I'm not sure you are carrying the inventory, we are just transporting it.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have strategic inventory. It's about having the inventory in the right place where you need it. Certainly kind of not that lean approach. My approach is always to optimize. But in addition, by optimizing and understanding where your different demand patterns are, where the smooth parts, erratic parts, you can actually be more predictable. So even with the situation as it is within IAC, we've been very successful in optimizing our inventory as well and keeping it fairly neutral. So, making sure that where you do see big impacts, where you do have to put in larger buffers, and we have to, there's no other way to manage it with the Asia situation. It's having plans alongside that as well about, knowing when you're likely to burn that inventory off, understanding what the working capital impacts are of, is it less of a working capital impact to reduce your transportation frequency and take the extra inventory? And it's always doing that balancing and trade-off along the supply chains. But definitely there is opportunity, to optimize, but making sure that we do have the right strategic inventory in the right location to support us as well.
Alexander, we've often talked about that premium freight comes with the price of low inventory. It's part of the equation, if you like, for just-in-time in some cases. Is that balance changing in some ways from your point of view, or is that still the kind of strategic approach for manufacturers to take, or as you alluded to, is it a little bit more nuanced now in terms of finding the right location?
I think it's changing a little bit because, what we can see is obviously, as I mentioned, obviously most customers try to avoid premium freight because it comes at a price, for sure. But I think we have seen for many years the other extreme of premium freight. We went very much into very low-cost, ultra-cheap freight, and there's a lot of, let's say, options in between. I think looking into those options, that is something customers are doing at the moment. Instead of going just for the cheapest option, they try to probably, have a slightly more expensive option, which is giving transparency and visibility. That's something we see. And we see also more and more that especially, larger tier 1 customers and also some OEMs are starting really to build up, a strategic partnership with premium freight providers like time-critical companies and so on, which are looking really, let's say, more in a systematic approach into that aspect of logistics. Yeah, that is changing, and I think it also makes a lot of sense because ultimately, I mean, probably the ultimate cost you will not have in your logistics spend as such, but rather in your production still stand, which has to be avoided at all times. So that's something we see. What we also notice is that sometimes customers are consulting us more before they build up, let's say, certain production facilities as well, because looking into the global market of logistics, let me give you an example. I mean, from China you can transport anything, but from Mexico you cannot transport anything because probably, let's say, air capacities are not available there. You will not have that much main deck capacities like you have from China, so you have to consider basically what you produce where. And in that regard, we see also more discussions with our customers as well.
And especially those discussions have changed a little bit. A couple of years ago, they just asked for the price for it.
Right.
Now they have a kind of risk analysis within it. And this risk analysis, and they come to us because we are the experts. We know where the risks are, either geopolitical or infrastructural. Yeah?
But I must also say, I think we also have a responsibility, let's say, especially in premium freight. And I mean, we know exactly that many customers are looking forward whenever they have an emergency situation to have an onboard courier hired, or they would like to have, let's say, a charter directly requested and so on. And this is usually always, I would say, a bad choice. It's super expensive, and there are sometimes options in between where you can try to avoid a charter, where you can try to avoid an OBC, and I think we as an industry, we have a responsibility as well to go to our customers and basically tell them, listen, okay, I understand what you need, but there's probably a plan B, an option which is a little bit cheaper, which costs you probably, let's say, only 12 more hours. Is that acceptable for you? I think once on the economical side, we have this responsibility, and at the same time on the environmental side, because I think the charter request and the OBC, where you have an empty aircraft being positioned, I mean, this is the worst you can do in logistics. Right?
Yeah. Michelle, how are you looking at those risk factors as well that Christoph managed? Are you building those more into those plans? And what are some of the methodologies that you use for that?
Yes, certainly risk mitigation and understanding those risks early and actually doing the scenario plans around how do we actually deal with those risks. So certainly with the Ukraine situation, we were working together globally very early, understanding which suppliers were going to impact us, not only from Russia and Ukraine, but also from the surrounding countries, so that we had a very, very early understanding of which suppliers we may have issues with, and certainly working with our OEMs to understand jointly how we could best mitigate those situations. Because some we control, some we don't. And then we could have that conversation as well with our service providers, our logistics service providers, along the lines of, what are you seeing, what understanding you have, and then through our communities of practice or our global teams, share that information globally. So our European team is like the conduit because we're best placed in terms of time lags to work with America, to work with India, to work with China, Europe. So we are the conduit, and as soon as we know about those kind of risks, we're immediately communicating that with our teams globally. If it's a risk around Asia, we certainly work very closely with our Asia team now. So as I said, you don't get this regional kind of thing. You don't get any more, well, the Asia team deal with Asia. It's very much, if we've got situation in North America, shipping into Europe, we get involved. If it's parts shipping from Asia into America or into Europe, then we work with the relevant teams to help us with those situations. So it's understanding the risks, understanding globally together as a team how that might kind of expose itself, and then putting in the scenarios to try and offset that as much as possible.
And as we heard earlier with Renault, do you see that potentially leading more towards this condensed, localized, consolidated supply chains, also for IAC? Of course, I know there's many factors here, not least where your OEMs are going to, but from the decisions in IAC, do you see that happening?
Yes, we do. I mean, we're certainly looking more about strategic network design is a big thing that we're doing now. Can we consolidate through more hubs So where we would typically have less than truckload or spot buys, small parcels, can we consolidate those? Can we combine that with a single provider to do sequencing as well? So it's looking at all of those services and kind of, not just from a supply side, but also from a environmental side, you know, reducing the miles that are traveled, reducing the CO2 emissions. And we will always want, you know, good truck utilization, good management of that kind of side of it as well.
Excellent. We have a few minutes more. If there's any questions from the audience, as before, please put, oh, we have a hand up, actually, if we can have a mic to the young gentleman, I believe. Yes, very young, right in the middle. I think it's Bjorn, right? Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. My name is Bjorn Svenningsen. I am representing UECC. We're involved in European short sea shipping. We own a fleet of ro-ro vessels that we deploy in a network in Europe. It is a must, obviously, for the industry to have a vision. But I think also that we need to realign our discussion a little bit and recognize that, particularly on the in or on the outbound side, we are an industry in crisis. We need companies in the future that can actually execute visions. And I think it's important that we talk about what we can do today or what could have been done yesterday to improve or at least do something with the visibility we have, because the planning, the visibility we have is so poor. It's non-existent in some areas. We have vessels that are steaming into locations to load cargo for days. These are vessels that cost us $70, $80, $90, $100 million a piece, and there's no cargo for them. And this is something that we need to treat with a sense of urgency. So I'm just wondering, I'm not asking anyone in the panel in particular, but anyone could answer, and that is, what can be done today, yesterday, to improve the visibility so we can actually execute and live our visions? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bjorn. As Bjorn said, he's not asking you to reflect on outbound as such, but I think the point, which is well made, is around the real impacts that this disruption and lack of visibility is having on companies and their assets and ability to achieve the things we need to. So anyone has any reflections on how we can go forward?
I mean, just one reflection. I think you asked what we could have done yesterday, and I mean, I could give you a very technical answer right now, but I think the answer is probably we should have had more trust to each other. We have seen each other more or less, let's say, separated companies which are just doing their job, and there are contracts in between, and there are processes in between, and that's it. This was, let's say, even though we all came together on those conferences and had nice chats, basically, this was what we did in the past quite a lot. And it was all about cost and profit in the end. And I think you mentioned one word, which is, this is an industry in crisis in terms of inbound and outbound logistics. You're right. And in crisis, you see basically how good your corporation really is. And in fact, it's not. It's not good at the moment. And I think that is something, that is for me the key learning we have to take away from that crisis, and this is what we have to change. I think we have to build a much more trustful environment. We have to accept that everybody wants to make a profit, all right, yeah, that's what we are here for. Yeah, but at the same time, I think we have to see that, let's say, nobody of us can live without the other side as well. No? And that means basically there must be much more give and take. Yeah, and instead of having rigid contracts, yeah, and clear, let's say, Chinese walls, I think we have to work much more interwebbed with each other. Yeah, and then I think we can overcome a bunch of those challenges. Yeah, I think it's a much more agile approach than the traditional way we're working there in that regards. It will not avoid that you will have empty vessels standing around somewhere. It will not avoid that we might have, let's say, some inventory missing somewhere, but we would get better. That's my view, at least.
And especially on the short sea shipping. I mean, the difference between, in cost between short sea shipping and trucking is not that tremendous, but the level of reliability of those vessels and seeing with all the port congestions at the moment, I'm not sure if that would be an option for you to take that risk at the moment.
Typically within the regions that I work, our sea freight is not the biggest kind of mode that we use. However, I believe that we could have been probably more predictive about when to put the buffers in, because we put the buffers in COVID, but then it's kind of carried on, and I think we probably took them out or didn't leave them in long enough to give that stability in that part of the logistics sector. So it's kind of making sure that we do that. And also, as I said earlier, if we can make 75% of our demands predictable, then we're only talking about the 25% exception. But the problem we're seeing with the multiple situations that are kind of happening in the environment is those exceptions are getting more, and we just need to work closer and be more responsive together to overcome those exceptions.
Absolutely. I know we've run a bit over, and I think the audience will probably have my neck if I don't give them coffee soon. But maybe just to close, we can't figure out how to achieve everything we want for supply chain resilience overnight. But let's just close with the next key step you'd like to see taken in the industry to improve the resiliency and perhaps get closer to what Bjorn was saying and being able to achieve that sort of vision. So I'll start with you, Christoph.
Yeah. What I see is that the supply chains have to be simplified a little bit, and seeing, especially on the new mobility side, the number of variances is going down dramatically. Yeah. So if you go in and configure a Tesla, it takes you 2 minutes, while 5 Series BMW, you have the chance to think about it quite long. Huh? And this kind of simplification for sure helps. On the other side, what I said earlier is that the risk mitigation needs to be in there. So I don't think you can rely on one supplier anymore for a certain part due to the various geopolitical situations and which are popping up. Probably that risk mitigation again brings a certain complexity back into the supply chain.
So supply chain simplification is a good next step. Michelle?
Pardon?
No, I was just saying, Christoph's supply simplification would be a good next step. What would be a key next step for you?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, supply chains are global. We know that, you know, the world's got a lot closer place, but we need to look at our networks. As I said, we've invested very heavily in strategic network studies and actually re-engineering our supply chain logistics lanes and consolidating them and looking at do we need this part every day? Could we actually live with it being shipped twice a week or something like that, or once a week, so that we're not putting so much strain on the network? So we are, you know, constantly evaluating those decisions, and as you said, we can't have one partner, but what we need to do is bring them together, bring the information that all of those partners are collecting together, and then we can, you know, look at the whole in its entirety and understand where we've got the pinch points, because we will always need air freight, we will always need a premium service, we will always have a number of lanes that are predictable and regular, but we need to bring it all together and be able to look at it as a whole.
Thank you very much. Alexander?
I have two wishes. I mean, one is in regards to our industry customers. I would really wish to be more integrated, let's say, in production planning processes, and to understand really, let's say, how critical certain parts are, how high or low inventories are, and so on, because that would help me and my team to anticipate better, let's say, what kind of, let's say, problems might arise. That's one topic. And I think on the LSP side, the lesson learned is really, I mean, you have to be very flexible on forming new alliances. I mean, we all have to work together much more. Yeah, we should not see each other too much, let's say, only as competitors, but rather very often this competitor is very soon in the next crisis your partner. I think that's something we have to understand, and me being, let's say, really born with an airline DNA, I must say, I have to learn that there are probably other modes of transport as well, where I have to look to as well, even in time critical, even if it sounds strange. Yeah, like yesterday evening, the discussion I had with a colleague where we discussed about long distance trucking, and here we're talking about 15,000 kilometer trucking. Yeah, all of a sudden this becomes true. I think this is something we have to do in the future. And we all have to accept that probably we might lose a little bit of our profit because it's simply unavoidable in order to keep it more robust. Yeah? And in the end, consumers will have to accept, the end users of our products will have to accept that probably prices are a little bit higher. Yeah, that's a reality, at least from my point of view.
So the prices are just a little bit high, so that's at least a good recognition. No, thank you very much. That's a very honest and I think practical answer. I want to thank the panel for this great discussion. I think we've picked on got into some really interesting areas, a lot of further discussion points to take up. Thanks again to you for that.